This is Robert Aldrich from the University of Sydney. Before we start, if you like royal history, then may I recommend another series called the Royal Studies Podcast. Hosted by the Royal Studies Network based at the University of Winchester in the UK, the series covers topics related to monarchical history and features new research and publications in the field of royal studies. Tune in for interviews, roundtable discussions, and more. The Royal Studies Podcast is available from wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to our series of podcasts on monarchy in peril. I'm Cindy McCreary, an Associate Professor of History at the University of Sydney, Australia, and a Director of the Modern Monarchy and Global Perspective Research Hub.
And I'm Robert Aldrich, a Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Sydney.
In other episodes, we've discussed colonialism in monarchy. In this session, we want to talk about decolonisation and monarchy. Colonialism and decolonisation are, of course, two sides of the same coin. They involve, on the one hand, the expansion and then contraction of overseas empire, and on the other hand, they involve the subjection and later emancipation of conquered countries. We've seen that colonialism bolstered some European dynasties, but it also weakened or destroyed many indigenous ones. But what about monarchy in the unwinding of empire and in its aftermath? What impact did decolonisation have on monarchies, both the colonizers and the colonized?
A number of monarchs who ruled over distant domains lost their colonies. For example, after defeat in the world wars, Germany lost its colonies after the First World War, and its colonies were divided between Britain and France. It goes without saying that there was no consultation with the Africans and Pacific Islanders in that change. The King of Italy lost his throne in the Second World War, and Italy lost its colonies at the same time. Japan also lost its colonies at the end of the Second World War. In that case, the emperor survived, but as a symbol emperor, in the words of the Japanese constitution, he is a figure without political power. And the loss of colonies to monarchs continued. Decade by decade after the Second World War, other monarchs who reigned over distant domains watched as their colonies slipped away. This is, after all, the great period of decolonisation globally. The British sovereign was no longer Emperor of India after 1947, when India and Pakistan became independent. The Dutch Queen no longer reigned over the East Indies from the 1940s, when the East Indies became independent. More on that case presently. The Belgian king journeyed to Africa to preside over the independence ceremony for what had been the Belgian Congo in 1960. And rather interestingly, he had his ceremonial sword stolen by a protester at that event. And we should add that France also lost most of its colonies in this period. Of course, France no longer had a king, hadn't had a king for more than a century.
Not all was lost, however. The British monarch still claims a dozen overseas territories, such as Gibraltar and the Falkland Islands. And King Charles III also remains head of state over no fewer than 14 countries outside the United Kingdom. The Dutch king reigns over 5.5 islands in the Caribbean. One of those islands, St. Martin, is actually divided between the Dutch and the French. And the Danish king still reigns over Greenland and the Faroe Islands. Somewhat surprisingly, perhaps, the independence of colonies around the world did not see the restoration of pre-colonial dynasties, at least in most places. Perhaps by the 1940s and 50s, too much time had passed since local kings had reigned. Or maybe monarchy simply seemed anachronistic, especially with more radical ideologies, including republicanism and even communism, that propelled some colonies to independence. But some monarchies do remain. Independent Malaysia, a former British colony, has a monarch. In this case, the position actually rotates among the 7 hereditary sultans of Malaysia. There are other exceptions too. Think of the Gulf states in the Middle East.
Southeast Asia provides a variety of different fates for royal dynasties with decolonisation. In Vietnam, for example, the emperor abdicated in 1945, though it would be years before that country became independent from France, and even longer for it to be a unified country. In Cambodia and Laos, kings remained on the throne. In Cambodia, famous King Sihanouk was on and off the throne for many years during the very troubled history of that country. The Lao king reigned until 1975, when he was overthrown in a communist revolution. As for Malaysia, which became independent from the British, the constitution provided for the election of a king from among the hereditary sultans and rajas. And there is the unusual case of Sarawak on the island of Borneo. For a century, it had been ruled by an English dynasty, the Brooke family, the so-called White Rajas of Sarawak. It was their personal country. After the Second World War, with decolonisation, Sarawak was incorporated into Malaysia, and the last Raja went into exile. Let's now explore one case of decolonisation more closely in a country that neighbours Malaysia, the Dutch East Indies, now known as the Republic of Indonesia, was the Netherlands' largest and its most important colony. In Indonesia, there are about 6,000 inhabited islands, and the country had a population of 68 million people in 1945. The Dutch had established their first trading outposts in the East Indies in the 1600s. The East Indies was famed in particular for things like spices, such as pepper and nutmeg. From Java to Bali, that huge archipelago encompassed multiple religions, cultures, societies, and a number of indigenous rulers. During the colonial period, it was the Dutch monarch who reigned over this huge, diverse, and valuable territory, although some of the sultans were left in power under the Dutch monarch. The Japanese occupied the islands during the Second World War, but then Indonesian nationalists declared independence from the Dutch in 1945. In vain, the Dutch tried through war to re-establish control of their old colony, but the Indonesian Republic endured, although with some interesting continuing importance for the sultans.
To tell us more, we're now joined by Dr. Bayu Dardias Kurniardi. Dr. Kurniardi has a PhD from the Australian National University and teaches at the Universitas Gadjah Mada in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. He works on Indonesian sultans and aristocrats in the late colonial and post-independence period.
In this podcast, you will be hearing about two cities. First is Jakarta, Jakarta. It was the capital of the colonial Dutch East Indies and is now the capital of the Republic of Indonesia. The other is Yogyakarta, Yogyakarta, which is sometimes pronounced Jogjakarta, which is a different place. Yogyakarta was and is one of the centers of Malay culture and tradition, and the royal capital of the Sultan of Yogyakarta.
This interview was recorded using Zoom. Bayu, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
There were many hereditary rulers and other aristocrats in the pre-colonial East Indies, and several dozen hereditary rulers, sultans, remained under Dutch rule. What was their position under colonial domination? Did they have any political role and privileges?
Under the Dutch colonial rules, they are around 278 rajas and sultans in Indonesia. The Dutch have a limited personnel to maintain 17,000 islands. So the Dutch use those local rulers to maintain control. So therefore, it's called indirect rules. So the Dutch is not directly ruling the people. Until the Japanese arrive, those 278 sultans and raja have some important ones. They are mainly in Java and some other areas in Sumatra, in Delhi, for instance. The Dutch have a contract. It's called long contract because it's quite detailed contract for those small rajas like in Eastern Indonesia, which only control at the village level. They have the short contract or korte verklaring. They have independence as long as it's follow the Dutch rules. So when some of them are not following the Dutch rules, they are sent outside up to the South Africa, for instance.
And what was the position of these sultans during the struggle for independence and the war against the Dutch? What was their role in the foundation of the Indonesian Republic?
And when the struggle for independence, most of them are joining the Dutch, so they are not on the side of the Republican cause, except for the Sultan of Yogyakarta in 1940. He refused any cooperation with the Dutch, and it's quite extraordinary at that time. Other aristocracies believe that the struggle for independence will be lost, and they will return to their glorious era under the Dutch. But Sultan of Yogyakarta, he take the side to the Republic, supporting the movement on independence.
Can you tell us more now about the case of the Sultan of Yogyakarta, who is by rights also the hereditary governor of the province of Yogyakarta? This is a really interesting case of a monarch within a republic, isn't it?
Yes, after we had an independence in 17th of August 1945, Sultan of Yogyakarta offered the Yogyakarta as temporary capital for 3 years, 1946 to 1949. He also have various ministerial posts, not only under Sukarno, but also under the Suharto period. So he was the first vice president of Suharto. So Sultan Hamengkubuwono No. 9 of Yogyakarta have a long political career from 1940 to late 1970s. The government arrangement for Yogyakarta is quite different with other provinces or areas. So most of these 278 that I mentioned before has been dissolved in 1950 during the formation of the province, the formation of the district and cities. But Yogyakarta maintained the status of special region. So under the special region, which continue until today, the sultans is automatically become the governor of Yogyakarta. So whoever become the sultans will be the governor of Yogyakarta. And in Yogyakarta, there are also small independent areas called Paku Alam. And whoever become the leader of Paku Alam will become the vice governor. So this is one of the reward of this struggle for independence because of the support of the sultan at that time.
You're listening to Monarchy in Peril from the University of Sydney. And today's guest is Bayu Dardias Kurniardi.
Bayu, this is a really interesting story about the birth of independent Indonesia. It's remarkable that in Yogyakarta there's still a hereditary sultan who now is also the provincial governor. Can you tell us more about this?
At the national level, we practice electoral democracy for all of the public offices, but in Yogyakarta, there are no governor elections. Yogyakarta is the second smallest province after Jakarta. With these small areas, the Sultan can maintain this relationship with its people. That's why since 2012, the government has been regulating the status of Yogyakarta as our last traditional monarchy in Indonesia. Every year, the government gives special budget to Yogyakarta to maintain Javanese culture. There's a lot of aspect in Javanese culture that we need to preserve. Since 2012, the sultans of Yogyakarta can have their land back. The government gives this authority. Some of the land that previously belonged to the sultan is returned back to the sultans. The condition for other aristocracy in Indonesia is quite different. During 1945, they took side of the Dutch. this kind of aristocracy cannot survive. However, since the Reformasi in 1998, the sultans and rajas in all over Indonesia have another opportunity to compete for the political arena through the political process. So some of them are becoming local region mayor, and one or two of them become the Senate. For instance, the Sultan of Ternate, the Sultan of Tidore is always representing these local areas through the Senate.
Bayu, isn't there some debate now about succession to the throne of Yogyakarta, since the heir to Sultan Hamengkubuwono X is a woman?
Based on the law, only men can become a sultan. We still don't know the result of this succession because the sultans only replace after the current sultan pass away.
Thank you to Dr. Bayu Dardias Kurniardi for your participation in this podcast and for your very interesting comments about the position of the sultans in colonial and post-independence Indonesia. And there we have an introduction to the complex and fascinating history of those sultanates in the East Indies and in contemporary Indonesia.
In the next podcast in this series, we turn to the former British colonies that are now independent states of the Commonwealth of Nations. We ask why some have kept the British monarch as their head of state, while others have become republics, or may be about to do so. Thank you for your company today. We look forward to you joining us for another podcast from the Modern Monarchy and Global Perspective Research Hub.
This series of podcasts has been created by the Modern Monarchy and Global Perspective Research Hub at the University of Sydney. Please see our website for further information at global-monarchy.sydney.edu.au. The text of the podcasts were written by Associate Professor Sidney McCreary and Professor Emeritus Robert Aldridge. And the series was produced by Peter Adams from the University of Sydney School of Humanities. The podcasts are copyright by the University of Sydney, and the authors and interviewees retain rights to their material. We acknowledge the indigenous Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which the University of Sydney stands.